There's a truth about addiction that nobody wants to hear. Not the rehab centers, not the support groups, not the therapists, and definitely not the people suffering from it. It's a truth so uncomfortable, so challenging to everything we think we know about recovery that most people would rather stay addicted than face it. But Carl Jung knew this truth. He lived it, he studied it, and he spent decades trying to help people understand that addiction, real addiction, isn't what you think it is. It's not a disease that happens to you. It's not a chemical dependency that controls you. It's not a weakness that defines you. Addiction, according to Jung's revolutionary understanding, is actually your psyche's desperate attempt to tell you something that you've been refusing to hear your entire life. And until you're willing to listen to what your addiction is really trying to communicate, until you're brave enough to face the inner truth that your substance use has been protecting you from, you will never, ever be free. You can go to treatment 1,000 times. You can collect sobriety chips like trading cards. You can memorize every recovery slogan ever written. But if you don't understand what Jung discovered about the psychological roots of addiction, you'll either relapse or you'll become what he called a dry drunk. Someone who's technically sober, but still completely disconnected from their authentic self. Here's what's going to shock you about Jung's approach to addiction. He didn't see it as something to be eliminated or conquered or fought against. He saw it as a symptom of what he called soul loss, a psychological state where you've become so disconnected from your true nature, so alienated from your authentic self, that you need external substances to feel anything resembling wholeness. And here's the part that will blow your mind. Jung discovered that the very thing you're addicted to, the substance or behavior that seems to be destroying your life, is actually pointing you toward exactly what your soul most desperately needs. Your addiction isn't your enemy. It's your unconscious mind's crude but desperate attempt at self-medication for a wound so deep, so fundamental, that you've been running from it your entire life. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When you use your substance of choice, when you engage in your addictive behavior, how do you feel in those first few moments? Not the guilt that comes after, not the shame, not the consequences, but in those initial moments of use, what happens inside you? Do you feel relief, connection, peace, wholeness, like you can finally breathe, like you're finally home in your own skin? If you're nodding right now, if you recognize that feeling, then you're beginning to understand what Jung discovered. Your addiction isn't giving you something foreign or artificial. It's giving you a taste, however brief and ultimately destructive, of what it feels like to be authentically yourself. The problem isn't that you're seeking this feeling. The problem is that you've forgotten how to access this feeling without external substances. You see, Jung believed that every human being is born with what he called the self, capital S, an integrated, whole, authentic version of who you really are, beneath all the conditioning, trauma, expectations, and social programming that gets layered on top of you as you grow up. But for most people, especially those who develop addictions, something happens early in life that causes them to disconnect from this authentic self. Maybe it's trauma, maybe it's neglect, maybe it's just growing up in a family or culture that can't tolerate your real emotional needs. Whatever the cause, you learn to hide your true nature, to suppress your authentic feelings, to become someone else in order to survive. And here's where it gets really interesting. Jung discovered that when you disconnect from your authentic self, when you exile the real you into what he called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything you've rejected about yourself, your psyche doesn't just accept this loss. It rebels. It creates symptoms. It generates what Jung called neurotic compensation, psychological and physical manifestations designed to force you back toward wholeness. Addiction, in Jung's understanding, is one of these compensatory mechanisms. It's your unconscious mind's attempt to reconnect you with the authentic self that you've lost. The substance gives you a glimpse, a taste, a temporary experience of what it feels like to be whole again. But because it's artificial, because it's coming from outside rather than from integration of your authentic self, it only works temporarily. And each time the effect wears off, you're thrust back into the painful reality of disconnection from who you really are. This is why willpower doesn't work. This is why just say no is psychological nonsense. This is why most treatment programs have such abysmal success rates. They're trying to take away the symptom without addressing the underlying soul wound that created the need for the symptom in the first place. Let me tell you about James, a client who came to see me after his third stint in rehab for alcohol addiction. James was a successful attorney, highly intelligent, well-educated, with every resource available for recovery. But he kept relapsing, and he couldn't understand why. He was working the steps, attending meetings, following all the conventional wisdom about addiction recovery. But something was missing. When we started exploring James's story through a Jungian lens, everything began to make sense. James had grown up in a family where emotions were seen as weakness, where vulnerability was punished, where he learned early that his authentic feelings weren't welcome. His father was a stoic, emotionally unavailable man who valued achievement above all else. His mother was anxious and controlling, needing James to be perfect to manage her own insecurities. So James learned to split himself in two. He developed what Jung would call a persona, the mask you wear in the world, to be socially acceptable. James's persona was the successful, composed, rational attorney. But his authentic self, the part of him that felt deeply, that was creative, that was vulnerable, that had needs and desires that didn't fit his family's expectations, that part got buried in his shadow. And alcohol was the only thing that allowed James to temporarily reconnect with his authentic self. When he drank, he could feel his emotions. When he drank, he could be creative, spontaneous, real. When he drank, he could access parts of himself that had been locked away since childhood. The problem wasn't that he was seeking this connection. The problem was that he'd never learned how to access these parts of himself consciously without alcohol. This is the inner truth that Jung discovered about addiction. You're not addicted to the substance. You're addicted to the feeling of temporary wholeness that the substance provides. You're seeking reunion with your authentic self, but you're looking for it in all the wrong places. And here's why this understanding is so crucial for recovery. If you try to get sober without doing the deeper work of reconnecting with your authentic self, without integrating the parts of you that have been banished to the shadow, you'll either relapse or you'll become what recovery circles call white-knuckling it, technically sober but miserable, disconnected and spiritually dead. Jung had a term for this, the cure that is worse than the disease. Money. When someone stops using their substance but doesn't do the psychological work to reconnect with their authentic self, they often become more depressed, more anxious, more spiritually empty than they were when they were using. Because at least when they were using, they had brief moments of feeling alive, connected, whole. Without the substance and without authentic self-connection, they're just numb. This is why Jung was so critical of treatment approaches that focused only on stopping the behavior without addressing the underlying psychological split. He understood that addiction was actually a spiritual crisis masquerading as a medical condition. It was the soul's attempt to heal itself, even if it was going about it in a destructive way. But here's the hope that Jung offers. If addiction is really about seeking connection with your authentic self, then real recovery becomes possible when you learn to access that authentic self consciously, deliberately, without external substances. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, of integrating all the parts of yourself that have been split off, rejected, or buried in the shadow. The most radical part of Jung's understanding about addiction is this: the substance you're using is actually a distorted mirror of your authentic self. Whatever feeling or state of being you get from your drug of choice, Whatever psychological experience it provides, that's a clue about what parts of your authentic self you've lost touch with and desperately need to reclaim. Are you addicted to alcohol because it makes you feel more social, more confident, more able to connect with others? Then, somewhere in your development, you learned that your natural social self wasn't acceptable, and you buried those parts in your shadow. Are you addicted to stimulants because they make you feel energetic, focused, capable of achieving? Then, you've likely disconnected from your natural drive and ambition, probably because expressing those qualities wasn't safe or supported in your early environment. Are you addicted to opiates because they provide a sense of peace, comfort, freedom from emotional pain? Then you've almost certainly learned to reject your natural need for comfort, nurturing and emotional support, forcing these essential human needs into the darkness of your unconscious mind. This is what Jung meant when he said that every addiction contains within it the seed of its own cure. The substance is showing you exactly what your psyche most needs to heal, but it's offering a false, temporary, ultimately destructive substitute for the real thing. Real recovery means learning to provide yourself with the authentic version of what the substance has been counterfeiting. Jung spent his final years developing what he called the Individuation protocol for recovery, a step-by-step process for using addiction as a doorway to authentic self-discovery, rather than just eliminating unwanted behaviors. This protocol has 7 specific stages, and each stage builds on the previous one. The first stage Jung called the Great Acceptance, learning to see your addiction not as a moral failing or a medical disease, but as valuable information about what parts of your authentic self you've disconnected from. This requires a complete reframe of everything you've been taught about addiction and recovery. The second stage is the shadow archaeology, systematically identifying and reclaiming all the parts of your authentic self that you've been forced to reject, deny, or hide in order to fit into your family system and social environment. This isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a deep emotional excavation that often brings up tremendous grief, rage, and terror about becoming someone you've been taught was fundamentally unacceptable. The third stage is the trauma dialogue, directly addressing the original wounding that caused you to fragment your authentic self in the first place. This often requires you to face painful experiences that you may have spent decades avoiding through addictive behaviors. The fourth stage is the authentic self-emergence, learning to express and embody the integrated version of yourself that includes both your adapted persona and your reclaimed shadow parts. This is where recovery becomes about more than just eliminating unwanted behaviors. This is where you start becoming who you were always meant to be. The fifth stage is the relational revolution, completely restructuring your relationships to support your authentic self rather than your adapted persona. This often means releasing relationships that were built around your dysfunction and building new connections with people who can support your authentic expression. The sixth stage is the meaning reconstruction, discovering what gives your authentic self a sense of purpose, direction, and significance. Most people struggling with addiction have lost touch with what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to find meaning and purpose beyond immediate gratification and survival. The seventh and final stage is the integration mastery, learning to live as an integrated, authentic person while navigating a world that often rewards unconsciousness, adaptation, and the suppression of authentic self-expression. This is a lifelong practice that requires constant vigilance and conscious choice-making. But here's what I need you to understand. Jung's approach isn't easier than conventional treatment. In many ways, it's much more challenging because it requires you to completely transform who you are, rather than just changing what you do. It requires you to face everything you've been avoiding, to feel everything you've been numbing, To become everything you've been taught was unacceptable about yourself. Most people aren't ready for this level of psychological excavation. They want recovery to be about willpower and behavioral modification, about attending meetings and following steps, about managing symptoms rather than transforming underlying psychological structures. But for people who are tired of managing their addiction and ready to use it as a pathway to authentic self-discovery, for people who want to understand what their substance use has been trying to communicate rather than just eliminating it, for people who are ready to become who they really are instead of who they've been adapted to be. Jung's approach offers something that conventional treatment doesn't: the possibility of using your greatest wound as the source of your greatest healing. Because here's what Jung understood that most addiction treatment misses: you're not broken, you're not diseased, you're not morally deficient. You're a whole, complete, authentic being who has been forced to fragment and adapt in order to survive in systems that couldn't tolerate your full humanity. Your addiction isn't your enemy. It's been your unconscious mind's crude but persistent attempt to guide you back to wholeness, to reconnect you with the authentic self that was never actually lost, just hidden in the shadow of your unconscious mind. Recovery isn't about becoming someone different. Recovery is about becoming who you've always been, underneath all the conditioning, trauma, and adaptation. Recovery is about reclaiming the integrated, authentic, whole version of yourself that existed before you learned that your real self wasn't safe or acceptable in the world. This is possible. Not just sobriety, but authentic wholeness. Not just elimination of unwanted behaviors, but integration of disowned parts of yourself. Not just managing symptoms, but healing the soul fragmentation that created the need for external substances in the first place. Your addiction has been trying to tell you something important about who you really are, what you really need, what your soul is desperately seeking. The question isn't how to silence this communication, but how to understand what it's pointing toward and find authentic ways to honor what you're really seeking. This is Jung's gift to anyone struggling with addiction: the understanding that your greatest wound can become your greatest teacher, your deepest pain can become your most profound healing, and your most shameful behavior can become your pathway to authentic self-discovery. The choice is yours. You can continue trying to manage symptoms and eliminate unwanted behaviors, or you can begin the journey of using your addiction as a doorway to reclaiming your authentic self, integrating your disowned shadow parts, and becoming the whole, integrated, authentic person you were always meant to be. Your soul is calling you home to yourself. Your addiction has been the crude but persistent voice of this calling. The question isn't whether you'll listen, but whether you'll listen consciously, courageously, with the commitment to follow wherever this journey of authentic self-discovery leads you. Welcome to the beginning of your real recovery. Welcome to the possibility of using your deepest wound as your pathway to your most profound healing. Welcome to the journey of becoming who you really are.